Everybody. Welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, February 23rd. And my name is Heather Kraus. I am very, very excited to see you all. And you found your way to Talking Data Equity. And Talking Data Equity is an informal drop-in gathering that's hosted by We All Count, which is a project dedicated to building tools and providing trainings that help you embed equity in your data projects. And one of the things we do, in fact, my very favorite thing we do is this thing on Fridays called Talking Data Equity, which is open to anybody from any part of the world in any sector who's interested in kind of practical, concrete ways to align the data work we're doing with the values and the people that we're trying to center in the way that we work with data. And we do record this, and we record it to post online for people who want to go back and watch different sections, and for colleagues and friends who aren't able to make it at the specific time and want to catch up online. And where we post the recordings is in our We All Count Data Equity Forum. I've just shared the link to that. And yes, there's a question in the chat that says, are you going to post last week's? And the answer is yes. It will be online very soon. That one was a little bit unusual in that we needed to get some permission checks to post it online, but it will absolutely be online before Monday, because I think we have just finished that. So thank you for asking, and thank you for your patience. I know that one's taking a while. Before I turn it over to our guest speakers today, I want to give you a little idea of the logistics. We're going to be together for about an hour, and our guest speakers are going to share some stories and share an example and share some slides. And while they're doing that, we ask that you ask your questions and put your comments and have any conversations related in the Zoom chat. And then once they're finished their presentation and sharing their stories, if you'd like at that point to raise your hand and turn your mic on, that's the time for live question and answers outside of the chat. So in other words, on mic. So we do ask that if you are not one of the guest speakers, you keep your mic turned off just during the presentation part. Okay. And if you want to ask a question or make a comment, there's two ways to do that. You can put the Zoom drop-down menu to everyone, which means everybody who's here and everybody who watches the recording will be able to see your question or comment. If you feel more comfortable just direct messaging me, go ahead and do that. Just set that blue drop-down menu to my name, which is Heather Kraus, and I'll do my best to amplify the private questions without attaching your name. All right. So on that note, let me introduce you to today's guest speakers. So we are very, very lucky to have two people willing to share their direct experience in embedding equity in a data project with us. And first, we have Kris Gowen, who has a PhD and over 25 years of experience in evaluation, that she uses deep methodological tools that emphasize qualitative and community-based methods. And her most meaningful evaluations have had her partner with Indigenous organizations, peer-led sexuality education programs, youth-run drop-in centers, and a mental health crisis clinic. Currently, Kris is in the same city as me, Toronto, as an internal evaluator at World Education Services in their social impact division. So thank you so much for Kris spending time with us. And Kris has brought along a fabulous collaborator who is Abby Bandurraga, who has an MSW and is a subject matter expert on the expansion of the U.S. registered apprenticeship system, and has over 2 decades of experience designing, implementing, and evaluating programs in workforce and education systems. Her work is deeply grounded in promoting equity and accessibility for historically marginalized and oppressed communities, and currently she is a technical assistance consultant with the American Institutes for Research, Human Services Division in the Workforce Program area. And she is joining us today from Portland. So I will now turn it over to the two of you. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and share your example. I am really looking forward to it.
And thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here as well. I'm a frequent flyer when it comes to being at Talking Data Equity. And so this presentation actually came from that experience, in that I think I just dropped in an experience that I had in the chat, and a lot of people were like, oh, I want to learn more about that. And so then based off of that, Heather invited me to come. And then knowing that this was a community-based research project, it didn't really feel right to do it solo. So that's when I asked Abby to join me, and I was lucky that she said yes. So I thought I was going to hit the next button, and apparently we're going to now figure out all the different ways we can hit something to make the slide advance. And I am trying all the arrows and all the everything, and I don't know how to do it. Let's see. How about that? Is that going to work? No. All right. Well, welcome. Oh, haha. I discovered a method. All right. So before starting the presentation, both Abby and I would like to acknowledge the lands that we are on. And so I would like to hold space and acknowledge the land that I'm sitting on. For thousands of years, Toronto has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this city is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be here and work on this land. My commitments include continuing to educate myself on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action and reflect on how my work and daily actions can address those.
I see some people are also doing land acknowledgements in the chat, and that is really awesome. Thank you so much for doing that. I'm located in Portland, Oregon, which is where this research was conducted. And Portland is on the unceded lands of the Multnomah, Wasco, Kapalama, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and a lot of other tribes that made their home along the Columbia River. And I just want to honor and acknowledge all of the Indigenous folks from the past, the present, and those that will remain to be here in the future. And I'm just committed to continually educating myself about the impact of historical or of colonialism on and colonization on Indigenous peoples and their lands, and to support initiatives and research by Indigenous communities for Indigenous communities.
And so in addition to Abby and myself, this team that worked on this project was vast. So, and here are the names of some of the people. You'll hear Terry Cross's name mentioned a lot today because he was one of the principal investigators and integral to the work. This project is actually old, and yet we find ourselves continually using the information today. And in fact, I've been working at World Education Services since just since July, and I've already been to 2 presentations where this work's been referenced. So I find it very heartwarming to know that it's still meaningful and being used. The project was funded from 2007 to 2015 by several U.S. federal agencies, the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, the U.S. Department of Education, and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So with this, all these different federal agencies, as you can imagine, different metrics were wanted from their grantees. And in addition, there was also this very important issue, where our initiative was based on, which was addressing what are the metrics we should be looking at. And that's what Abby's going to be talking about next.
Thanks, Kris. We were faced with an issue in Oregon in 2005, where Oregon became the first U.S. state to enact a legislative mandate that said that evidence-based practice had to be used in substance abuse and mental health services. And in order to receive state funding in Oregon, or to get it in the future, agencies and organizations had to demonstrate that 75% of their services were evidence-based. And so for a lot of communities, the question was, well, whose evidence? What evidence? And the Oregon legislature was very clear that their definition of evidence had to be grounded on scientifically based research. So our PI, Terry Cross, was really deeply concerned about this legislation and the impact that it was going to have on services for Indigenous communities, and specifically the Native American Youth and Family Center, or NAYA, here in Portland, Oregon, which provides educational, workforce, mental health, and other services that are really grounded in cultural traditions to an urban Indigenous community that represents over 380 tribes. So the services that were of primary concern for this project were those for the youth in the community, and especially for transition age youth that were getting ready to leave school or leave foster care and transition into adulthood. So there were a lot of reasons that there was this concern for Terry and for other leaders, and not the least of which is, as many of us know, a history of non-consensual, harmful, even violent research practices that have been imposed on historically marginalized and oppressed peoples. And this includes medical research that was done non-consensually on Indigenous youth that were already in boarding schools that they were forced to be in. So another issue was that in many Indigenous communities, RCTs, random control trials, which are the gold standard in intervention studies, are not valued at all and are even seen as not ethical because they withhold treatment or an intervention that is seen as being potentially helpful from other members of the community that are in the control group. So given this history, as we started out this project, it's not surprising that when we set out to review the literature and look for identify evidence-based practices that supported the well-being of Indigenous youth in the research literature, we found exactly nothing in the research literature at all. And for intervention studies that were around transition age youth that said they had Indigenous folks in their sample, the sample size was too small to do any kind of analysis or to make any kind of claims about effectiveness or efficacy. So the question for our team was, in this context, how do we demonstrate that NAYA's culturally based services are effectively meeting this evidence threshold that was established by the Oregon legislature so that they can continue to get funding that was helping their program provide all of these services? So our solution, which is ours, meaning this came from our leadership, which was from Terry Cross, was to use a practice-based evidence framework. So that is research methods that were based on information gathered from the service providers, the families, the youth, and other stakeholders to identify those effective interventions in the NAYA context, as well as areas for improving their practices. So we did this through a partnership with NAYA in using community-based participatory research with a practice-based evidence framework. We looked at all of their case management, interventions, how they did things. We looked at the rationale, and then we had all of these meetings with elders, youth, other members of the community. And what we were collecting was their felt knowledge, their knowledge about what contributes to the well-being of all youth in the community. They didn't want to just focus on at-risk youth. They wanted all youth. So we looked at what their goals were for youth in their community and what cultural factors were explicitly supporting youth well-being. And this was a really important, using the community-based participatory research, using practice-based evidence, were super important in this community because felt knowledge was a lot more valued than science or book learning knowledge. So an example that we would run into quite a bit would be the sentiment of, look, we know that sweat lodges work because we see the effect of sweat lodges in the community. We've seen the effect of it, the positive effect for hundreds of years, and we just don't need a study to prove to us that this is an effective practice. So our approach was, okay, well, let's gather what effective practices are from the community perspective in the Native American Youth and Family Center community. And I'm going to turn things over to Kris to go a little bit deeper into how we approach that.
So what ended up happening is we needed to hearing that we wanted to root things in practice-based evidence, and also hearing the felt knowledge component. We had to sort of, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, downstream as well, but like this idea of walking in both worlds constantly between our, as you can imagine, our funders were like, well, you need to officially evaluate these programs to see how things are working and document the evidence of how these young people are doing in this situation. And so we started out going, okay, now we need to create some tools to create to start evaluating the programs. So what did we do differently to create this evaluation when you compare it to the white Western approaches to research and evaluation? Well, as a first step, we approached this work using a theoretical framework that was rooted in indigenous cultures. Terry Cross used the term relational worldview to describe a model in which the complex relationships between the context, mind, body, and spirit domains of a person's life are affected by any change experienced. So if something happens, all your quadrants are impacted. And therefore, any effective health interventions really must address all these forces and ultimately promote balance in a person. So not just improvement in one area, but in several. And so this is much more holistic than a white Western approach usually. And so this ultimately was the model that shaped our approach to evaluating NAEA's youth services. So that's the first part. And then second, the way we collected data, we did that in ways that were culturally aligned to determine what outcomes to measure in NAEA services. So we conducted focus groups with youth and community members and service providers in order to hear from various perspectives. And the community members, by the way, also included parents. And these focus groups were chosen to provide and honor opportunities to tell stories and share experiences. And then in order to document the voices of the elders, Terry actually created and hosted a bingo game that established ways of gathering information. So those were the ways that we collected the data. And then the other piece is that each time we engaged in data collection, we framed it around one question, which was, what does success look like for Native American youth? And we chose this question because it was open-ended and it was strength-based as opposed to like risk-focused, which is often how we frame a lot of youth things is in terms of risk. And so that is what we did in terms of those two things. So yes, so this is what we did is collected data with the focus groups and the bingo game to say, what does success look like in young people? And through that data collection, we heard and we listened to every voice equally, and all ideas were incorporated as we place them into the relational worldview model. So these are some examples of some of the community generated outcomes. And as Abby and I were talking about this presentation, we remembered, actually Abby remembered, and then I was like, oh yeah, like it was really interesting that there was very high overlap between how the young people defined success for themselves and how the elders did as well. That was like one of the biggest correlations, and we thought that was just kind of neat. So after we started placing these outcomes into the quadrants, we circled back to the community to validate our model and the placement of these factors in the relational worldview model and how they define success. Now I have to flip slides and notes on the same time. So that was great. Like we felt like we did a thing and we were excited that we found some outcomes and put them into a theoretical model that made sense culturally and everything. And that led to another problem, which was how are we both going to honor community identified outcomes and recognize the white Western funding obligations that we had to those federal funders? So whose values ultimately were going to be reflected in these evaluation tools that we were charged to create? So we felt pretty confident that we understood what youth outcomes mattered to the community, and yet we still needed to measure those outcomes that we heard in the community plus the evidence base that was being mandated by the federal funders. So Terry referred to this as walking in both worlds. So, and in addition, we kind of actually had to walk in three worlds because another tension that we were facing was rooted in that Oregon law around what constituted an evidence-based program in terms of its outcomes. So we were really juggling those three. And so that was the problem we were now facing. And so the solution, I think, is what Abby's going to now talk about.
No worries. So the solution that we did was we took these variables that were identified by the NAIA community, and then we just started scouring the literature and like, how can we connect these variables? Are they associated with any outcomes in the literature about youth, either correlationally or causally? Like, how can we build some evidence that these are impactful? And what that ended up looking like is this Venn diagram on the next slide, where you can see on the left, starting with positive cultural identity, these are the variables that were really important in the NAIA community. And you can see that a lot of the variables on the left, I realize it's not the hugest print in the world, but many of those variables are about connectedness, you know, belonging to your community, mindful of your community, belonging at school, being connected, as opposed to variables on the right from the research literature. So when you look at like higher self-esteem, that's a really kind of individualized, outcome, and isn't really about being your connectedness with other folks. NAIA stands for Native American Youth and Family Center. So it's a weird acronym, but that's what it stands for. So again, on the right are the research literature outcomes for transition age youth. And so there's some outcomes I think you can see that are kind of similar or seem like they're getting at the same thing, but it's really about how they're framed. So in the research literature, it's reduced antisocial behavior, which is again like a very internalized thing. Where on the right or on the left, sorry, I'm so confused with my directions, but on the NAIA identify variable, it's more about community mindedness. It's not like you're lowering, but we're building a relationship that puts us in a community that impacts our behavior. And so as you can also see at the little circle where the Venn diagram meets, is that there were some identified variables from the NAIA community that also were found in the research literature. And so those were also included in how we were going to establish this assessment tool. And Kris is going to talk about how we got to that.
I am? I guess. Oh.
The cross.
Ha. Yeah, I was hitting mute. That's just how that works. So at any rate, what we did in 2010 was, so this is 2010 data visualization, and we're talking to Heather beforehand too. We're just going to show our little warts and everything about this is not how I think I would portray and show this in 2024, but in 2010, we created this crosswalk on the vertical axis. So going up and down are the outcomes that were identified in the research literature that were more highly valued by the white Western approaches to health, and that were also prioritized by our funders. And then the ones in red, though, on that column were also documented as being important to NAIA's community. And then along the top are additional outcomes that we heard during our own data collection process that we wanted to look at. And so as that next step, we found measures from the literature and developed some of our own that basically were for the ones on the top. So things like community mindedness and positive cultural identity and things like that. And because we found that those, so if we look at positive cultural identity, for example, the lime green, we found that that was in the literature related to lower alcohol use, reduced suicide, school success, increased school belonging, all these things that our funders cared about. But if we had just told our funders like, oh, NAIA's youth programs increase positive cultural identity, especially back then, they were kind of like, okay, that's nice, but where are your real outcomes? And so our argument essentially was that no, positive cultural identity inherently is a real outcome because it's the outcome that matters to the community. And B, positive cultural identity is a quote unquote real outcome because it's also associated with all these other outcomes that are the ones that you are sort of funding us to talk about. So that was sort of the idea of what we did. So we created this assessment tool that um, that captured, I think we ended up with about 17 measures. So it was big. We're not going to lie there, but it served three purposes. The main one was it was a case management tool. So case managers used it with the young people they were supporting to talk to them about their balance in their life using the relational worldview model and places that they wanted to work on together in a case management setting. So that was the primary purpose. But then we also were able to use this case management tool to document outcomes for the funders we were also able to use the tool for program evaluation and to seek future funding. So it really served three purposes. And so while the form was long, the fact that its primary use was for the care of the young people themselves helped with the burden of data collection. And then another thing that I think was really important that we did was every year we met with the case managers to talk about the case management tool and its origins to because there's high turnover as well, but like to talk to case managers that like the community really actually helped develop this tool. And you were part of that community, not you maybe individually, but case managers were part of developing this tool because we really wanted to keep the historical memory of its community-based development at the forefront um, of the minds of the NAIA staff. So that's sort of our little foray into our crosswalk, but we really also wanted to talk about some of the lessons learned during the process, both back then and now. So for me, the thing that really stuck with me is that community-based research takes time, and that, to quote Adrienne Marie Brown, to move at the speed of trust is exceedingly important. White Western researchers, again, as Abby was articulating earlier, have been unethical and violent in the name of research, and coming into NAIA's space was an honor. And we really wanted to build that trust to make sure that we understood how we were centering NAIA's community first in this work. And also, as a person who definitely can exhibit some type A tendencies, it was a big lesson for me to learn to slow down and to really listen and understand what was happening and understand the cultural context of why I need to slow down and work that way. Another thing was putting white Western definitions of success aside to listen to what really matters to the community. The way I was raised and other things, community mindedness would not have come up as a definition of success when I was a young person. That was just not something that just would have happened. And so understanding that that was one of the top things that mattered, or cultural identity, things like that, I think is very important to note. And the another part that was really like Abby was referencing self-esteem. My dissertation, which was in adolescent development, had a high component of sort of self-esteem and self-efficacy in it. And to understand that like that absolutely did not matter like one iota in the NAIA community was really funny for me to be like, what do you mean? Like blah, blah, blah. It's associated with all these other things, like at any rate, I had to just get off my little academic high horse and listen to see what really mattered. And in another way too, framing questions and normalizing behavior was a big lesson I learned. I thought here's an example of where I thought I was doing a good deed and I did not do a good deed at all. As a relatively new evaluator whose experience was mostly rooted in measuring the impact of sex ed programs, I had learned, or I was really big on normalizing behaviors to get honest answers from young people. So instead of asking young people, for example, if you have had sex before, the question would just get phrased as, how many times have you had sex, and have none be one of the answers. And the hope there would be like, oh, we're just going to show young people that it's okay and it's normal to have sexual, sexual experiences. I tried to use that translation on alcohol use with the young people at NAIA. So I made a question that was just first, how often do you drink alcohol? And we had a group of young youth advisors on creating the measures, and they on no certain circumstances, basically told me, they're like, you do not normalize alcohol use among our community because that is a stereotype. You need to ask us first if we even drink alcohol. And it was like, oh, right. I got a serious talking to by the young people. I learned. And instead of thinking I was normalizing, I was actually encouraging a stereotype. So that's an example of where, of a lesson that I learned and I always hold with me today.
So I was in graduate school when this happened, through my master's and into my doctoral research. This was my very first ever research study. So I would imagine my surprise when I went and learned that other research was not conducted in this way with this kind of, oh, you get to, spend a year getting to know the community and being invited in. So having this be my first really big research experience really profoundly impacted my work and still impacts my work, even though I'm not so much in the research game anymore. It really taught me a lot about outsiderness and the value of treating yourself as an outsider in different communities, and to lean into discomfort. I was definitely I know that Kris got her talking to about normalizing alcohol, and a big challenge for me was that the way that I move in the world as a Latina, as a woman, as in a lot of different ways, was to make my presence known. I'm kind of loud. I have a big handshake. I have a very firm handshake. I was kind of taught like this is how you shake hands to let people know that you are just as valued. And when you're moving in these groups and you're asking them to share information with you and just joining them in community events to show that you are invested in their community, the last thing they want for you to do is to break their hand. And so I was told that by Terry Cross, who was like, Abby, the elders know that you can break their hand. It's a sign of respect that you don't. And the way that we the way that we shake hands here is more of a tapping of hands. So I will tell you that my handshake is forever messed up because I'm always thinking like, how am I coming into this space, trying to hold how I move in the world, but being respectful of how I'm moving in these other worlds that I am not a member of. And so I really try to incorporate that into my work now, regardless of whether I'm doing policy advocacy or developing and designing programs or technical assistance. I know that there's rules where I'm considered a subject matter expert, but I don't bring that in my space. I really try to come into new work and come into new communities with the positionality of like a curious outsider who really wants to understand before I dig in and start, pontificating about what the best practice would be or how to do these things. So I think I'm profoundly grateful for having this be my entry into this world.
And so continued reflections, again, as Abby and I were working on this presentation, and it's like, what would we do differently? Because we definitely looked at some of our work and had some cringeworthy moments. This work was done again in 2007 to 2015. We also have grown as researchers and approach things differently. A couple of the things that I've noticed that if I were to work on this project today, I would definitely frame our work more directly in terms of colonialism, as well as discuss more directly the violence and abuses Indigenous communities faced in the name of academic and government research as a framing for some of the stuff we did, like some of the work that we did together. And then also as questions that will always sort of circulate in my mind as I conduct research and evaluation are things like, according to who? Why are we measuring? Why are we measuring this? Why are we asking a question this way? How are my identities impacting what I'm doing? And I always try to really reflect on and value the importance of community-based work and take that step back and listen, as Abby was talking about, being that curious observer.
Yeah, and I think that when Kris and I've reflected on how we put this information out into the world at the time that we were doing this study, when we went to presentations, when we were publishing papers, there was a real centering of the researcher story. we did this thing, we did so good. Look at us doing this great thing. That's really kind of, in a lot of ways, it's still upholding that kind of hierarchical valuing of knowledge and like it. And so I feel like that rather than focusing on this good thing that we did as researchers, that again, looking at that kind of explicitly calling out colonialism, specifically calling out these other things, to be able to say, look, this is a community story, and it's a community story of, once again, Indigenous people being forced to demonstrate the things that they know internally to dominant culture on dominant culture's terms. And I think that that's something that we could have really focused on more than how exciting it was that we did that. So I think that is something that we both talk about quite a bit. That's all I've got.
Yeah, that's what we got.
Awesome. That was a lot. I really, really appreciate it. And I do always love it when we can have a talking data equity that is just like Kris, you were saying, that is in response to a request we got in a previous talking data equity session. Please tell us about that experience. And I can tell you for sure by the comments that I'm getting and the comments you can see publicly that there's a lot of appreciation both for the work that you did on this project and your willingness to continue to reflect and share the lessons learned. That's something that everybody working on data equity is really hungry for, and not everybody's willing to share. So I really, really appreciate it. And this is a time now, if you're in the room live with us and you'd like to turn your mic on and ask a question, that would be fabulous. All you need to do is raise your hand in the Zoom style, which is like push on the button that says reactions and then raise your hand. Or if you're not in a position to do that, just turn your video on and turn your microphone on. And if you don't want to do that, you can ask a question in the chat. And while we're waiting to see if anybody in the room wants to ask a question, there's a couple of questions in the chat that I will amplify. There's one that has a lot of upvotes that says, were there any NIA identified outcomes that were especially hard to connect with kind of the research, Western white style?
Yeah, I think it's the component of the Naya's perceptions of what hope and spirituality were, which was more of a collective sense. So there's hopefulness, like, I hope that this turns out okay, like from a personal standpoint, and that's oftentimes what we think of as hope. And when you look in the literature, that's what hope is measured as. And then there's sort of like the hope for a better humanity or a better space, and that spiritual belief of that connecting. And I think that we struggled a little bit with that because, again, in the literature, we had to sort of rely on different perspectives of what hope and what spirituality are. Spirituality is not church going. Spirituality is I keep holding my heart as I'm trying to explain what this means, but that's where spirituality is there. And then in community, and I think that was a big challenge.
And I feel like hopefulness in this community was rooted in history, right? It's rooted in the perseverance, is rooted in the resiliency. It was just such a different weight than the hope that you saw in the literature. And I think that's the best way to describe it, is like the weightiness of hopefulness versus the concept of hope that was in the literature.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another question that's come up a few times in the chat is, how did the people who were involved in the focus groups and sharing their ideas, how did they receive, or what feedback did you hear about connecting the kind of direct lived experience, the lived evidence, to the Western academic white style evidence. Was there pushback around that? I think is the question.
Yeah. Not that I remember. Abby might remember differently.
Course.
The other piece was that we were very transparent about what we were doing all the time. Like,
Yeah.
here's what we need to do. And that's where Terry also was very helpful, as well as Nicole Maher and Sarah Kostelik and some of the other people who are indigenous and tribally affiliated would talk about that walking in both worlds, that it's this sort of,
Mm-hmm.
you know, necessity to get at what is needed and the purpose of the research. So we were as a team, we were constantly circling back to the communities and giving them updates on what was happening. We went to NEA often to talk about what we were doing and why, and explained. And so I don't remember resistance. Abby, I don't know if you did.
No, I don't recall resistance either. I think, again, it comes back to that. This is a community that is so used to having to demonstrate to a dominant culture that their things have value. And so I think they just recognize, like, look, this is a necessary part of how we continue to support ourselves and thrive in this community, serving this large indigenous, Portland's like the 9th largest indigenous community, urban indigenous community in the country. And it's like, we need to be here. And this is part of that process. And so I do think, as Kris intuited earlier, like what came out of this and the assessment tool was really long. It was really long. And I think that for that group of community members were like, oh my God, this is so long. And it's like, and when we went through and kind of went through everything with them, it was like, what can we really take out? There isn't really anything to take out. And it was made longer even with the questions, because we were told, stop normalizing these different behaviors. That means that we had extra questions to add in as well, which made it longer. Like, instead of like, how often do you use drugs? How often do you use alcohol? How often do you do this? So there was, I think, when you explain things, that made a lot more sense to that specific group of community members.
And also for us, for cultural identity, a lot of times there were specific behaviors and like activities, I shouldn't say behaviors, activities that we would talk about. And because NEA represented so many different tribes, and different tribes have different activities that have different cultural meanings to them, the list became longer as a result of the fact that we were working with an urban indigenous community, as opposed to, if we were on a specific reservation, for example. I think that would make it different.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's a really good point. I'm glad you elevated that. I had to put that part in place. That's really useful. Okay, another really important question. Thank you so much for the last point about centering the harmful practices of Indigenous folks having to continue to prove the worth and value of themselves and their values to the dominant culture. It's so important. Do you have ideas or recommendations about how to explicitly talk about the harms of colonialism, white supremacy, and racism with policymakers and leaders who just don't believe it's real?
It's the
It's
For
so,
me, as
yeah.
go ahead, Abby, go first.
No, go ahead. I'm thinking.
So one of the things that I've met with a modicum of success is, and again, like when you're dealing with the all the way over to the who don't think it's real, um, I like to think in tiny baby steps toward something. And I do a lot of this as well in like my sex ed work with, like, there is a gender binary and I will respectfully disagree with that. And so like moving. So it's meeting that, like, again, it would highly depend on the individual, but it's sort of like meeting that person where they're at, or what is a story that they can relate to, in the sense of um so for the example of the, like, for example, like with residential schools, it's like asking them how much do they know about the residential schools, and do they I would I'm scared to say this, but like I'd be hard pressed to find somebody who said that that was a good idea, or like they were executing, like they were done well, right? Like, so it's like, okay, so like here's cultural erasure of what's happening here, or what is your story of, or your understanding, that story of what was happening here. And so just talking about where they like that, like what their knowledge is there. And the other piece sometimes I will look at is how have you benefited, depending on who the person is, right? So I like, again, as me, as a white Western person um, whose family was not born in North America, it's just like, okay, what is like our immigration story and the challenges, and how might they be different if the color of my skin is different? And also, how did I benefit from the ability to come over here? How did my family benefit from the ability to come over to Canada? And how does that impact? And so, like, by definition, I came over to land that was already had people on it. So how did I benefit from something like that too? And so I'll just ask questions there. But again, it just totally depends on the person. It does. It's kind of cop out.
Yeah, I think I think that question is so challenging. I appreciate some of the examples that you gave, Kris. Um, and I think it's really hard with policymakers too. They're beholden to a lot of different interests, and so that becomes more challenging. I do think that meeting people where they are and getting that edge. And I guess an example I use is it's not in the research space, but in one of my in a role that I have, there's like a national rollout of EEO laws in the apprenticeship world, and including a requirement that anyone that has a registered apprenticeship program in the United States has to provide anti-harassment training. And there was a lot of pushback, as you can imagine, like, oh, we don't. And so a lot of times when I would go into these communities, especially in the construction trades, where it's predominantly white men who were getting older, is that's where I would start. I would be like, well, we can't discriminate against age. What about, all these? And so really starting with a place that was closest to them and why it was of value to protect their interests, and then being able to broaden it a little bit at a time.
Yeah. I think your ideas are really quite useful in terms of paying attention to where the person that you're trying to have the conversation with is, and what are the actual rules, regulations, and laws that govern that person's behavior. Because that's often overlooked. And Nikki Bowman has taught me a lot about that, about how much we forget to not worry too much about somebody's emotional state, but here are the laws that you are required to comply with. Yeah, so hat tip to Nikki for that, for sure. Another thing that I think about a lot in terms of how to explicitly talk about these harms is being really, really careful. And we've talked about this. Yeah, huge shout out to Nikki for sure. And as practitioners, as people interested in data equity, being really, really careful whenever we present disaggregated data about how we write a narrative around that. So there's a really big difference between presenting disaggregated data that says a Black person has more food insecurity than a white person. That's very different than saying a person who's experiencing racism is experiencing more food insecurity than a person who's not. And so being really careful about what we comply with when we label people and when we highlight differences, how we label those differences. And we've had a couple of talking data equities about that as well.
Yeah,
I
the
want to
Eli
get
Holder is the one that's really coming to light too with the
exactly.
data visualization as well, is that when we point out differences and we attribute cause to those differences,
Mhm.
or rationale, or even just how we display a difference, can really matter. And the
Yes,
science behind Eli's work is eye-opening in any time. Like,
highly
yeah.
agree. And if you weren't at that talking data equity, we have a recording of Eli Holder and Peta Blakely talking about that. So you can just search that on the forum. I'll give you the forum thing. I want to get to one more question before we run out of time. And that question, this is a great question to end on. So given the fact that many of us are also operating in a Western space, what are 2 to 3 wishes that you have for us to enact and to voice to amplify these practices? Like, how could we continue to kind of pick up the work that you've shared with us today and take it forward in reframing in ways big or small?
One that I think is that question of like, what does success look like to you? So if you're evaluating a program, if you're doing research, like what, like back to the whose outcomes, being able to ask whoever you are working with, are, you know, like wherever your work is centered around the people who are most proximate to the issues, the people themselves, like what matters to you, and see and take a good critical look in terms of how that's matching with your assumptions of what was mattering, or potentially, like, as you know, I've been saying over and over again, your funder. What does your funder matter? So that's one. No.
Excellent. Do you have one to share with us, Abby?
I have so much going through my head right now. I think that there is, you know, is there a better way to collect data? Is there a better way? It doesn't have to be a random control trial. Can we do these other, are there the other ways to frame our, how can we join with the community? And I think there's enough literature out there to support other ways of collecting data and information. And then the other thing is really transparency, and not transparency in being able to translate into the so that the community can understand and receive, and being willing to accept their pushback. So I think there's a lot of ways. I will say, like, one of the things, and I'll be really quick because I know we're getting to the end of our time. I mean, one of the things that was really challenging for both Kris and I, being outside of the community, was trying to untangle what we were receiving from the community, and the way that the communication flowed was very different than the way that we were used to giving and receiving communication in a dominant culture setting, in a research setting, in an academic setting, like all of these ways. And so it really took us a lot of time to be okay with that and to untangle it and not burden the community with trying to explain to us, but really leaning into the resources that we had with Terry and Sarah and Nicole and some of the other folks that were on the project to help us understand. And again, just not placing that burden on them to communicate the way that we were used to being communicated with.
And more more superficially, actually, though, to the coming up, stalling for more time, but to be really transparent about the biases and lack of objectivity inherent in quantitative data collection, I think can really help in terms of stories and things like that, which I know this group does very well, and we talk about that a lot. But I think that's another way to look at to sort of move like the needle, like Abby's saying about different ways of collecting data and what kinds of knowledge matter more, is to sort of point out that we are all flawed, all research is flawed. And that doesn't mean we should stop doing research. It just means being transparent about the limitations of what things are. So
Yeah, well, I think we'll leave it there, since that's the whole reason we all got exist, is to try and break through that myth that as long as you do quantitative data correctly, it's value neutral. Everything else is subjective, but quantitative data is objective is a extremely damaging, harmful myth. And that's what we are about. So thank you so much, Kris and Abby. It has been extremely valuable to hear about your experience and the generosity with which you've shared the details, and the lessons learned have really, really meant a lot. Thank you so much. For people who are interested in continuing this conversation, the recording will be shared in the forum, and also next Friday, same time, same Zoom link, we're actually continuing this topic. We have Lori Nesbitt from the Yurok tribe and a research collaborator of hers named Annie Krakoff, who are going to join us and talk again about some data collection involving and analysis involving trying to center an Indigenous way of understanding in some quantitative work. So that'll be next week. And take really, really good care of yourselves and each other for the rest of today and the week. And we'll see you next Friday. Bye, everybody.
Bye.